Restaurant owner's racism expels black couple, but when he discovers their true identity, he is left in shock and immediately regrets his actions. What happens when an act of discrimination reveals secrets that could change everything? On a fateful night, a black couple is expelled from an upscale restaurant, only for the owner to discover the next day that they are more than they seem. Richard Warren, a 50-year-old man proud of his restaurant in Chicago, has always believed that his clientele should be selective, keeping minorities at the margins of his concept of success. This elitist view, inherited from his father, shaped his life and business, but he never imagined his actions would have such profound consequences. Angela and David Brooks, a black couple, enter Richard's restaurant seeking a pleasant evening, only to realize they are not welcome. The manager, following Richard's implicit orders, rudely informs them that no tables are available, even though the place is empty. The air is thick with discrimination, but the couple decides not to cause a scene and leaves in silence. This decision, however, does not spare them from the repercussions that follow. The next day, Richard comes across a news article highlighting Angela as an influential leader against racism in Chicago, a revelation that makes him realize the gravity of his mistake. As Richard grapples with guilt and the urgency to redeem himself, Angela and David see an opportunity to turn this experience into a call to action. David, a civil rights lawyer, decides he cannot let this injustice go unchallenged and begins to plan to expose the entrenched racism in institutions like Richard's. What starts as a simple dinner transforms into a battle for justice and dignity, testing not only Richard's convictions, but also the couple's strength in a world that often marginalizes. Richard's restaurant, a symbol of exclusivity, becomes the backdrop of a growing conflict. Angela, determined to make a difference, decides that the best way to confront prejudice is through inclusion. Instead of suing Richard, she proposes an event that challenges the owner to examine his own beliefs. What began as a night of disdain evolves into an opportunity for transformation, not just for Richard but for the entire community rallying around the cause. As events unfold, the story reveals Richard's internal struggle as he must confront his own flaws and prejudices. He faces the choice of opening himself to change or allowing his empire to crumble under the weight of the truth. Amid this crisis, he must reflect on what success truly means and whom he wishes to serve. The moral dilemma intensifies as public pressure becomes overwhelming, and Richard realizes that true strength lies in embracing diversity rather than excluding it. In a world where discrimination remains a reality, Angela and David's journey for justice intertwines with Richard's quest for redemption. The story not only highlights the fight against racism, but also shows that transformation is possible, even for those who once succumbed to limiting beliefs. The unexpected encounter between these lives, with their differences and challenges, becomes a powerful testament that love, inclusion, and understanding can indeed overcome hate and discrimination. Rich. The image of Angela and David Brooks leaving his restaurant in silence haunted him. He recalled the expression on their faces, a mix of sadness and dignity, and the realization that, for a moment, he had contributed to their pain consumed him. The article he read about Angela not only highlighted her fight against racism, but also revealed her role as an influential activist in Chicago. Richard could not ignore the irony. He who took pride in his establishment was now the embodiment of everything Angela fought against. As he had breakfast, the television whispered news about protests and voices calling for justice. He found himself pondering, what have I really built here? The restaurant was his legacy, a space he believed reflected his success. But now he questioned whether the exclusivity he had cultivated was, in fact, a barrier to progress. The challenges now facing him were greater than he had imagined. Angela and David, on the other hand, were determined to turn their experience into something positive. David, a civil rights lawyer, was no stranger to the fight against discrimination. He knew that to change the narrative, he needed to take action. Together with Angela, he began planning an event that would bring people from diverse backgrounds together for a dinner celebrating inclusion. The idea was simple: to show Richard and the community that love and acceptance were more powerful than exclusivity and division. However, David also faced his own challenges. He knew that touching on the wound of racism was dangerous, and that even with the best intentions there could be repercussions. He remembered moments when he had fought against injustices, but also times when he had felt powerless. That feeling haunted him, yet it also fueled his determination. He could not allow fear to paralyze him. Change required action, and he was willing to lead that fight. At Richard's restaurant, the pressure began to mount. Customers were continuously commenting on the incident, and many questioned whether they should continue patronizing a place that exhibited such attitudes. The phone rang incessantly, with journalists seeking statements, and community pressure became unbearable. Richard felt as if he were caught in a whirlwind. He had never faced a challenge. The choice between maintaining his elitist vision or opening himself up to a new reality felt colossal. At first, Richard tried to ignore the situation, but guilt and shame haunted him like shadows. He remembered his father, who had always told him that success was built on exclusivity, but now that belief no longer made sense. With each passing day, the pressure mounted, and Richard realized he needed to take action. He decided he needed to better understand Angela and David's perspectives, which led him to seek information about activism and the experiences of those who faced racism. He found himself reading books and watching documentaries, trying to educate himself on issues he had previously ignored. When the day of the event arrived, Richard was nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect, and the thought of having to face Angela and David left him unsettled. At the same time, he knew it was a unique opportunity for redemption. The anticipation in the air was palpable, and the room was filled with people from different backgrounds, united by a common purpose. Richard watched as Angela took the stage, her strong and inspiring presence commanding attention. She spoke about the importance of inclusion and acceptance, and Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Meanwhile, David observed Richard from a distance, trying to decipher his emotions. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but there was something about Richard that seemed different. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that David hadn't noticed before. What Richard was facing was an internal battle, a clash between his old beliefs and a new reality he could no longer ignore. The event unfolded in an atmosphere of hope and discomfort, and at the end, Richard was called to the stage. He hesitated, but the words that escaped his mouth were sincere. He spoke about his failures, how his view of success had been wrong, and how he was willing to change. Acknowledging his mistakes was a powerful step, and the room filled with applause. However, he knew that the journey was just beginning, and that true transformation would require more than words. He would have to confront his fears and prejudices head-on, and that would be a far greater challenge than any notion of success he had known up to that point. Richard felt the weight of expectation as he looked out at the audience. The event was packed with unfamiliar and familiar faces, all there to hear his words. He knew what he said might not be enough to erase the pain he had caused, but it was a start. However, as he spoke, a wave of doubts began to creep into his mind. What would Angela and David think as they listened to him? Would they truly be willing to believe in his sincerity, or would they see it as just another empty attempt at redemption? Meanwhile, David watched Richard's every move. He wanted to believe that the businessman was genuinely remorseful, but distrust lingered in his heart. David had seen many who claimed to be allies, but, deep down, only wanted to maintain their positions of power. The fight for justice was long and fraught with traps, and he couldn't afford to be deceived again. Every time Richard hesitated or stumbled, David felt a knot form in his stomach. He hoped Richard would change for real, but the uncertainty kept him on edge. After the event, Richard was approached by some community members who were skeptical of his transformation. One participant, a young man named Marcus, directly questioned Richard. "How can you really change? You've spent your whole life creating a space that excludes people like us. What makes you think you care now?" The question cut Richard like a knife, and he hesitated before responding. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers, but the pain in Marcus's voice made him realize he needed to face this criticism. The pressure began to mount. Richard noticed that many of his regular customers were starting to pull away. Criticism on social media intensified, and he found himself struggling not only to save his restaurant, but also to find a new purpose. He began to wonder if his efforts were truly valid, or if he was just trying to extinguish the fire he had started. Each day became a new challenge, and doubt transformed into a physical weight he carried on his shoulders. Angela, for her part, was determined to support David in his mission, but also worried about Richard. She felt that no matter how hard he was trying to change, his actions still did not reflect a true understanding of the impact his choices had on the community. Angela decided it was time for a direct dialogue. In an unexpected moment, she asked to meet with Richard. The idea of confronting him made her nervous, but she knew it was important. Richard needed to understand that change was not just about words, but about actions. When they met, Richard was nervous but also hopeful. Angela began to talk about her experiences, about the small and large injustices she had faced throughout her life. Richard listened attentively, feeling smaller and smaller in the face of the pain she expressed. Despite his best intentions, he realized he still lacked the empathy necessary to fully understand what Angela and David were going through. Before we continue with this moving story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching this video from. The conversation quickly turned into a heated debate. Angela questioned Richard about his true motivations. You really want to change, or are you just trying to save your restaurant? What are you willing to sacrifice to make this real? Her words echoed in his mind, and he felt cornered. He realized that no matter how hard he was trying, he still hadn't risked enough. The idea of losing his business terrified him, but the possibility of not being an agent of change left him restless. In the following days, Richard found himself in a cycle of deep reflection. He began to spend more time with the restaurant staff, listening to their stories and experiences. This brought to light his own insecurities and fears. The reality of the racism he had previously ignored was now in front of him. He realized that throughout his life, he had always surrounded himself with people who thought like him, and this had isolated him from a greater truth. The emotional pressure was consuming him. Richard felt exhausted and his mind wouldn't stop working. He knew he needed to act, but what could he really do? He began to understand that change was not just a matter of words or events, but about building authentic relationships. This led him to reflect on how he had always treated his staff and customers. It was time to open his heart and mind. As Richard struggled with his own demons, David and Angela continued to unite in their fight. Their friendship grew stronger, and they began to plan new initiatives that could involve Richard in a more meaningful way. They knew they couldn't force him to change, but they also believed that, over time, Richard could become a true ally. Their journey was complex, filled with challenges but also with hope. Richard's decision was approaching, and he knew that his choices could not only shape his own future, but also impact an entire community. Richard was at a crucial moment in his life. After talking with Angela, he felt the urgency to change, but he still didn't know how to take the next step. In his mind, he repeated her words, each one echoing like a challenge. What are you willing to sacrifice to make this real? This question haunted him, making him reflect on everything he had built and what truly mattered. It was then that an unexpected event further shook his life. A violent storm hit the city, causing significant damage in several areas, including his restaurant. He received the news while at home, and panic took over his body. Upon arriving at the site, the scene was desolate. Broken windows, overturned tables, and water everywhere. Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled from under his feet. All his work, his dreams, seemed to have been destroyed in a matter of hours. As he surveyed the damage, reality imposed itself upon him. Richard wasn't just sad about the financial loss. He felt a deep sorrow knowing that, at that moment, there were people relying on his restaurant for their livelihood, employees who depended on their jobs, customers who saw the space as a refuge, and the community that had begun to gather there to foster a more open dialogue. He realized that, although he had sought recognition and success in his career, he had neglected the responsibility that came with it. The storm didn't just bring destruction, it also revealed truths that Richard had ignored. While clearing the mess, he found a note that an employee had left on his desk. It was a thank you for the opportunity to work there, but also a plea for Richard to consider inclusion and diversity in his future decisions. The impact of those words was immediate. Richard realized that the change he had longed for could not wait any longer. He needed to act, not just to save his restaurant, but to redeem himself in front of the community. In the days that followed, Richard made a decision. He called a meeting with his team, and instead of positioning himself as the boss he had always been, he sat among them. With a sincerity he had never shown before, Richard spoke about his failures, his lack of vision, and the need to change. He shared how the storm had been a wake-up call for him, not only to rebuild the restaurant, but also to rebuild his relationship with the community. To his surprise, the team responded with enthusiasm. They were willing to help him transform the space into a more welcoming and inclusive place. Meanwhile, David and Angela watched from afar as the restaurant recovered. They were skeptical but hopeful at the same time. Their friendship had grown stronger as they fought for a common goal. Angela, listening to Richard's stories about his recovery and his new perspective, began to see a small glimmer of hope. However, she knew that actions spoke louder than words. Richard would still need to prove that his intentions were real. As the weeks went by, Richard began to implement significant changes. He invited community members to participate in the decisions about the restaurant, seeking collaboration from everyone. He organized awareness events, where the voices of people who had previously felt excluded were now heard and valued. Richard saw the difference these actions made not only in the community, but also in his own life. He was moving away from the narrow view he had always had about success, and now realized that his true legacy could be something much deeper. However, the struggle wasn't easy. Richard faced resistance from some regular customers who did not accept the changes. He felt the pressure from a world that often values profit above all else. In moments of doubt, he remembered Angela's words and the note he had found. Those moments of reflection became the foundation of his new journey. With each challenge, Richard asked himself what truly mattered, and the answer was becoming clearer. The storm that destroyed his restaurant was, paradoxically, the force that propelled him to rebuild not only the physical space, but also his worldview. He began to understand that success would not be measured solely in revenue, but in the ability to impact lives and create a space where everyone could feel welcomed. Richard was finally starting to realize that true change required courage and sacrifice, and he was willing to face it head-on. The journey was just beginning, but he knew that each step forward brought him closer to a fairer and more inclusive future. Richard was in a moment of transformation. After the storm that devastated his restaurant, he found himself facing a new reality. The changes he had begun to implement were not just about the physical space, but about a new way of seeing his role in the community. He was striving to listen to the voices that had previously been silenced, but the consequences of his actions began to manifest in various ways. The day after the meeting with his team, he noticed that the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. People arrived with a sparkle in their eyes, excited to contribute. However, Richard also noticed that some old customers were watching with suspicion. He felt the tension in the air as he served tables, hearing murmurs about the changes taking place. For many, the restaurant was a familiar place, and the idea of inclusion and diversity seemed to threaten the tradition they had valued for so long. One afternoon, while preparing new dishes with the help of his team, Richard had a moment of introspection. He found himself remembering his childhood when he helped his grandmother in the kitchen. Food was a bond, a form of love and welcome. Those simple moments brought smiles and unity. Now he wished for his restaurant to reflect that, but the resistance from some began to weigh on his shoulders. He felt torn. On one side, a passion for creating an inclusive space. On the other, the fear of losing customers and, consequently, the livelihood of his team. In a conversation with Angela, Richard expressed his concerns. He knew he needed support and advice. He said he felt like he was doing something right, but what if it wasn't enough? What if people didn't accept it? Angela listened attentively, recognizing his internal struggle. She replied that changes were challenging, but that he was doing it for a reason. What mattered was that he remained steadfast in his convictions. This conversation provided Richard with some relief, but uncertainty still surrounded him. In addition to concerns about customers, Richard also faced financial difficulties. Sales had declined after the storm, and he received several complaints from customers who felt uncomfortable with the new approach. The restaurant, which had once been a success, Richard spent hours reviewing the budget, trying to find ways to cut costs without harming his team. He was increasingly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Sleepless nights became common as the pressure kept him awake, reflecting on every decision he made. Over time, Richard began to realize that his team was also going through their own struggles. On a particularly difficult day, he organized a meeting to discuss the challenges they were facing. The employees shared their frustrations and fears, and Richard felt touched by their honesty. He realized that, like him, they wanted to be part of something bigger. This meeting became a turning point for them as well, uniting them in a common goal. Together, they began to think of creative ways to attract new customers, such as themed nights and collaborations with local artists. Weeks went by, and the community began to respond. Some people who had been oblivious to the changes started coming into the restaurant, intrigued by the new proposals. Richard noticed a new type of customer, people looking for a space where they could connect, not just eat. This brought new life to his business, but also introduced new challenges. Richard realized he needed to adapt even further, listening to the new voices entering the restaurant and adjusting his offerings to cater to a diverse clientele. As the restaurant began to rise again, Richard recognized that he was learning to handle pressure differently. He started practicing meditation and taking walks, seeking moments of peace amid the chaos. These small changes in his routine helped him stay focused and face resistance with a more positive attitude. Each time he felt discouraged, he remembered the note he found among the restaurant's rubble, which motivated him to keep moving forward. Richard was on a path of self-discovery. He was not only seeking to save his restaurant, but also rebuilding his own identity and values. He learned that true strength lay in being vulnerable and in listening to others. This new perspective not only brought hope for his business, but also for his personal life. He realized that the journey was far from easy, but each obstacle faced was an opportunity for growth and learning. And so Richard continued to forge his path, determined to make a difference one step at a time. The changes he had begun to implement were not just about the physical space, but about a new way of seeing his role in the community. He was striving to listen to the voices that had previously been silenced, but the consequences of his actions began to manifest in various ways. The day after the meeting with his team, the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. People arrived with a sparkle in their eyes, excited to contribute. However, Richard also noticed that some long-time customers were watching with suspicion. He felt the tension in the air as he served tables, hearing murmurs about the changes taking place. For many, the restaurant was a familiar place, and the idea of inclusion and diversity seemed to threaten the tradition they had valued for so long. One afternoon, while preparing new dishes with the help of his team, Richard had a moment of introspection. He remembered his childhood when he helped his grandmother in the kitchen. Food was a bond, a form of love and welcome. Those simple moments brought smiles and unity. Now he wished for his restaurant to reflect that, but the resistance from some was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. He felt divided. On one hand, the passion for creating an inclusive space. On the other, the fear of losing customers, and consequently, the livelihood of his team. In a conversation with Angela, Richard expressed his concerns. He knew he needed support and advice. He said he felt he was doing something right, but what if it wasn't enough? What if people didn't accept it? Angela listened attentively, sensing his internal struggle. She replied that changes are challenging, but he was doing it for a reason. What mattered was that he remained steadfast in his convictions. This conversation provided a small relief for Richard, but uncertainty still surrounded him. Beyond concerns about customers, Richard faced financial difficulties. Sales had dropped after the storm, and he received several complaints from customers who were uncomfortable with the new approach. The restaurant, which had once been a success, was now a test of. Richard spent hours reviewing the budget, trying to find ways to cut costs without harming his team. He was becoming increasingly tired, both physically and emotionally. Sleepless nights became common as the pressure kept him awake, reflecting on every decision he made. Over time, Richard began to realize that his team was also going through their own struggles. On a particularly difficult day, he organized a meeting to discuss the challenges they were facing. The staff shared their frustrations and fears, and Richard felt touched by their honesty. He realized that, like him, they wanted to be part of something bigger. This meeting became a turning point for them as well, uniting them in a common goal. Together, they began to think of creative ways to attract new customers, such as themed nights and collaborations with local artists. Weeks passed, and the community began to respond. Some people who had been indifferent to the changes started coming into the restaurant, intrigued by the new offerings. Richard noticed a new type of customer, people looking for a space where they could connect, not just eat. This brought new life to his business, but also introduced new challenges. Richard realized he needed to adapt even more, listening to the new voices entering the restaurant and adjusting his offerings to cater to a diverse clientele. As the restaurant began to rise again, Richard started to learn how to handle the pressure in a different way. He practiced meditation and went for walks, seeking moments of peace amid the chaos. These small changes in his routine helped him stay focused and face the resistance with a more positive attitude. Whenever he felt discouraged, he remembered the note he found among the wreckage of the restaurant, which motivated him to keep moving forward. Richard was on a path of self-discovery. He was not only trying to save his restaurant, but also rebuilding his own identity and values. He learned that true strength lay in being vulnerable and listening to others. This new perspective brought hope not only to his business, but also to his personal life. He realized that the journey was far from easy, but every obstacle faced was an opportunity for growth and learning. And so Richard continued to forge his path, determined to make a difference one step at a time. He began to trust himself more, accepting help from his team and friends. Through failures and new beginnings, he found a fresh perspective that led him to rebuild his life. Success for him became something deeper than material wealth. It was about creating a space of love and welcome. Over time, new life lessons emerged, and Richard began to apply everything he had learned. He resolved his internal conflicts, moving forward with the support of friendships that had evolved along the way. Richard was at a critical moment. The restaurant, which had once been a symbol of his passion and dedication, was now becoming a battleground between his convictions and the resistance from a part of the community. He had worked hard to bring inclusion and diversity, but the weight of disapproval from some traditional customers left him distressed. That afternoon, while washing dishes in the kitchen, he felt that the world around him was about to crumble again. A major review was about to be published in a prominent city food blog. Richard knew that the critic's opinion could make or break his restaurant. He remembered the last time he received negative criticism. Sales had plummeted, and the pain of rejection still haunted him. Now, after so many changes, the pressure felt unbearable. He looked at the team working alongside him, all dedicated and hopeful, and wondered if all of this would be worth it. On the night of the critic's visit, the restaurant was full. Richard felt the energy in the air, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He had prepared a special menu, reflecting the new vision he had embraced, but the uncertainty of how it would be received made him uneasy. As he served the tables, he noticed two long-time customers who used to frequent the restaurant. They were at a table in the corner, watching everything with critical expressions. The tension in his chest intensified. During the service, one of the dishes Richard served was met with disapproving looks. He approached the table and, in an act of courage, asked what they thought of the dish. The customer, a middle-aged man who had always been a supporter of the traditional restaurant, looked at Richard and said, "Honestly, I don't like what you're doing here. This is not what we expected from your restaurant." Those words cut Richard like a knife. He felt the sting of rejection, but instead of retreating into himself, he decided to face the challenge. "I understand that changes can be difficult, but I'm trying to create a space that welcomes everyone. Food is a reflection of love and unity, and I want everyone to feel welcome here," he replied, his voice firm yet vulnerable. The man looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in Richard's words. What began as a tense conversation transformed into an open dialogue. Other customers at nearby tables began to listen, and the atmosphere shifted. Richard shared his experiences, his struggles, and what had inspired him to change. He spoke about his grandmother, about how the kitchen was a space of love and belonging. Richard's vulnerability touched the hearts of many. As he spoke, he noticed the critic listening attentively from his table. Richard took a deep breath and allowed himself to be authentic. He was not just defending his choices, he was sharing his truth. That night became a turning point. The critic, who had seemed indifferent until then, began to pay attention, taking notes. Through his sincerity, Richard had created a connection that transcended the dishes he served. By the end of the night, after the customers had dispersed, Richard received surprising feedback. The critic praised Richard's courage to open up and how his changes reflected a new era of hospitality. He wrote about the importance of inclusive spaces and the beauty of diversity in gastronomy. Richard could hardly believe his own words. The positive review brought a renaissance to his restaurant. The transformation he sought was not just about the menu, but about the relationships he cultivated. He realized that the failures and fresh starts he faced along the way were part of his journey of self-discovery. Richard learned that success was not about keeping everyone happy, but about being true to himself and what he believed in. The night ended with a sense of renewal. Richard looked at his team, who watched him with smiles of pride. The friendship that had solidified among them through challenges was stronger than ever. He realized he was not alone on this journey. They were a family, united by a common purpose. With a renewed sense of purpose, Richard knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but he was now more prepared. He had found his inner strength and learned that by listening to and connecting with others, he could not only overcome his insecurities, but also build a truly welcoming and vibrant space. And so, with renewed hope, he was ready to face whatever the future held. In the days that followed the positive review, Richard noticed a palpable change in his restaurant. Reservations began to increase, and new customers entered through the door, drawn by the newfound fame of his inclusive space. He felt revitalized, as if a new energy flowed through every corner of the place. The team, once nervous and insecure, now worked with smiles on their faces, driven by the certainty that they were part of something special. On a sunny morning, while organizing the kitchen, Richard felt the need to talk to his team. He gathered everyone around a table, and as he looked at the faces that meant so much to him, he began to speak. "You all know that this journey hasn't been easy, but each of you has played a crucial role in this transformation. What we've achieved together is far more than I could have imagined." One of the cooks, a young woman named Sophia, raised her hand. "Richard, you have no idea how much this has meant to us. Feeling that we are part of something bigger has given us confidence. I never thought I could create dishes that reflect my culture while being part of your dream." Richard smiled, realizing that the inclusion he sought had not only transformed the restaurant, but also the inner selves of each team member. They were rediscovering themselves and feeling valued. "This is the essence of what we want," he replied. "Food is a celebration of diversity, and each of you brings something unique to the table." In the following weeks, Richard decided to host themed nights, where the team could present dishes from their own cultures. He saw the enthusiasm grow. The longtime customers, who had once been skeptical, began to participate as well, open to trying new flavors and learning the stories behind each dish. On one of those nights, while serving customers, Richard noticed the presence of one of the most influential critics in the city. The man was sitting at a table, observing every movement, every dish that left the kitchen. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, but also a drive to show what his work truly meant. He remembered the transformation he had undergone, and that encouraged him. By the end of the night, Richard approached the critics' table. "He hoped that you enjoyed the experience," he said with a nervous smile. The critic looked at Richard, his expression neutral, but soon softened. "It was interesting to see the evolution of your restaurant. The way you integrated your team's stories and the diversity of the dishes is admirable. This brought a new freshness to your kitchen." The critic's words were like a balm for Richard. He felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for your words. I believe that gastronomy should be a space of inclusion and love. Every dish tells a story, and I want everyone to feel welcome here." Over time, the restaurant became a true meeting place for the community. Richard not only saw his sales increase, but also the creation of bonds between people from different backgrounds. Families who had once been strangers began sharing tables, laughter, and stories. The environment he had cultivated was flourishing, and the pain of the past felt more distant. On a particularly busy night, while Richard watched customers interacting and savoring the dishes, he sat in a corner and reflected on. He realized that success was not only measured in sales or positive reviews, but in the human connections he had fostered. The pain of rejection, which had once paralyzed him, now fueled him with a new purpose. He remembered the conversation with the customer who had challenged him on one of the most tense nights. Now Richard understood that even criticism could be a catalyst for growth. He was stronger and more confident, not only as a chef but as a leader and friend. The restaurant was not just a business, it was a home, a space where every story mattered and every person counted. And so, with a heart full of hope and determination, Richard was ready to continue his journey. He knew that new challenges would come, but he also knew that, alongside his team and the community he had built, he could face any storm. The kitchen, which had once been a place of anxiety, now pulsed with life and love, and that, for Richard, was the true taste of success. Richard watched the restaurant's activity, a place that had once reflected his loneliness and insecurity, now pulsed with life and diversity. He felt pride seeing his team so united, each contributing their unique stories and flavors. The journey he had faced, marked by challenges and criticisms, had transformed him profoundly. He was not just a chef. He had become a leader, a friend, an agent of change. The themed nights he had promoted not only enriched the menu, but also united the community. People from different backgrounds sat side by side, sharing laughter and stories, creating bonds that extended beyond the restaurant's walls. Richard realized that success was not measured only in numbers, but in the human connections that arose with every dish served. Reflecting on his path, Richard remembered the difficult moments, the criticisms that had paralyzed him. He understood that those experiences, although painful, were essential for his growth. Rejection had forced him to re-evaluate his vision and seek a more inclusive path. Now he saw criticism not as an obstacle, but as a catalyst for transformation. This made him stronger and more confident. The friendship that had formed between him and his team was one of the greatest treasures Richard had gained. Each member brought their own story, and together they built an environment of support and respect. Richard knew that without this unity, his restaurant would not have achieved what it did. He also recalled how, in a moment of sadness and loneliness, a customer had challenged him to be better. Now he wondered if that customer knew the impact his words had. Richard wished he could see how those words had been transformative. Over time, the restaurant had become not just a place for meals, but a home for all who visited. Richard decided it was time to give back. He began planning a special night dedicated to the customer who had challenged him. It was a way to show that he had learned from the criticism and that the restaurant was now a space of inclusion and respect. Richard wanted everyone who entered to feel they belonged, just as he had felt welcomed when he decided to open his heart to diversity. On that special night, Richard prepared a dish that symbolized the union of all the cultures represented in his team. He invited the customer who had challenged him not only to savor the dish, but to witness the transformation that his words had provoked. When the critic arrived, Richard greeted him with a genuine smile. "Thank you for challenging me to be better. Your critique was what led me to this moment." The man, surprised and moved, tasted the dish, and as he savored the flavors, his eyes sparkled. "You have truly overcome your difficulties, Richard. What you have created here is incredible. This is more than a restaurant. It is an example of how food can unite people." The words of recognition were a refreshing shower for Richard's soul. He felt that all his struggles were worth it. The feeling of revenge he had harbored against those who doubted his potential had transformed into gratitude. He had overcome adversity and become an admirable leader. Now, he invited everyone to reflect on their own journeys. Richard knew that we all face challenges at some point in life, but true victory comes from the ability to learn and reinvent ourselves. He wanted people to share their stories, because each account could inspire someone to move forward. Richard concluded his evening with a request to the audience. If you have faced difficulties, remember that it is possible to start over. Share your experiences, like and subscribe to the channel. Your story could be the light someone needs to find their way. Let's build a community where everyone feels welcomed and inspired. Together, we can make a difference.